Good morning, everyone. We'll be reading Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 33. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? For if he lays the foundation and is not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Will he not first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple."
A couple of folks have been teasing me that my voice is finally changing. Actually, it's kind of that idea that, when you're married, you share everything. Diana got the cold and then she shared it with me. So, but sometimes the best sermon topics come from questions that people ask. And I had somebody who's been asking me a question about this passage. They were reading in Luke and came across it. And it really causes people to sit up and pay attention. And so I thought it would be good to take this passage and to spend some time thinking about it. First thing, I want to make a point here, and if you look at probably the heading, if you've got a Bible with headings for this section, it may have something like about the cost of being a disciple. So one of the questions that came was, well, what about that term disciple, and how does that compare with the word like Christian or some of the other words that are used in the New Testament? So very quick, I know most of you will know this, but for those that don't, let's just kind of touch on it. There are some words in the New Testament that are used interchangeably. That is, that they are used for the same thing. Well, how do we know that? Well, we'll see a passage here. The word disciple, which we have Jesus using, and in Acts chapter 9, and if you look at the section here from 32 to 41, you find a couple of stories here involving Peter, and a couple of visits that he makes, and he goes to see the people in one community, and they're referred to as saints. And then he goes to Joppa, where Dorcas is, and the people there are referred to as believers and as disciples. So what does that tell us? Well, that the word saint in the New Testament, which means literally a holy one, but in the New Testament, the word saint is used for believers, for Christians. There's no special category of super Christian. It's just believers. They're saints. They're disciples. And the word Christian is also used. The passage here in Acts 11 says that the disciples were called Christians for the first time in Antioch. And what's interesting, if you're not familiar with this, it's kind of a surprising thing. Because the word Christian is the one that is most dominantly used, the word Christian is only used 3 times in the New Testament. Kind of surprising, isn't it? The first time here Second time, a little bit later in Acts, where Paul on trial, and the question comes to him in a short time, you think to make me a Christian? And then Peter will later say in his letter, one of his letters, that if anyone suffers for the name of Christian. You know, it's interesting that this has become the dominant word, where the word disciple or believer or saint is used more frequently. The word disciple literally means a student. In other words, that as Jesus put it, a disciple is, when he's fully taught, will be just like his master. And I think the thing to understand that a disciple is not somebody who is just receiving content in a subject. The idea of a disciple is somebody who is not just receiving the knowledge of his teacher, but who is learning the lifestyle. It was not just getting information, but it was what you became as a result of that. So that's what Jesus meant, is that, those who are his disciples, when they are fully mature, will be like him. Now, there's an important thought here, isn't there? Many of us have been Christians, been disciples for many, many years. Are we perfectly like Jesus? And we go, no. Why? Well, because we know we will never be completely like Jesus. We're always going to miss somewhere, not fully mature, not all the way there. And so there's that reminder that no matter how long I have been a Christian or a disciple, that there's always more to grow. There's always more ways to become like Jesus. And that's important to keep in mind. So, as Jesus is talking here, and what's important is to kind of note here in verse 25, that there's a large crowd. Actually, it says large crowds were following him. This is not a small group thing. He's not just talking to the apostles. He's talking to a multitude and telling them what it is to be one of his followers, one of his disciples, one of his people. I call this lesson a hard saying because it is a hard saying. There's a time or two in Jesus' ministry where the apostles would come to him, and after he said something, and they'll say, that's a hard saying. And the implication is that it's not just hard to hear, but it's harder to do. And that's what he's trying to communicate here. I think it's, when you really look at what he says, it's startling. It's almost alarming when you think about the different points that he makes in this. But what he's doing is that he is eliminating people who are the dabblers, who are half-hearted triflers, that basically want to follow Jesus kind of as the fad of the month. I mentioned before, but I think this is a good place to mention it, that there's a book that's come out recently that's kind of directed toward the kind of thing that a lot of people do in our age. And it's based on some of the social media where people identify themselves as a fan of something. And maybe you have done that. You've gone onto social media and you've found something that you like. On Facebook you click like. And maybe there's an entertainer, maybe there's a movie, maybe there's a group, and you click fan. Well, this book kind of addresses the fact that mentality that people have of being a fan. I mean, what does it cost you to be a fan of something? Really. In many ways, it's just clicking a button on your computer screen. Maybe your fanship consists of going a little further and you've bought some albums or you've bought some CDs. Excuse me, I dated myself. Albums, right. Okay, you bought some CDs, you bought some DVDs. Maybe you have posters in your room. But what does it really cost you to be a fan? Fanship is really nothing. And what Jesus is basically doing in these verses is saying, okay, you want to be my disciple, you're going to have to get really serious about this. In fact, you're going to have to get more serious about this than about anything else that you've got in your life. So this is a challenge to single-minded response to Jesus. So let's kind of look at what he does with this. And in that second verse, he uses a word that is why this is a hard saying. Hate. When's the last time you used the word hate? Maybe I shouldn't ask that. There are things that we may really, really dislike intensely. Some people, it may be vegetables. Maybe other things. But the word hate has the idea of malicious, hurtful feelings. You know, we identify the word hate as something that is incredibly negative and strong. Imagine somebody walks up to you and says, I hate you. I don't recommend doing that. But you talk about a deal breaker right there, right? You just don't want to keep going, and I mean, that's hurtful. And so yet Jesus says that if you want to be my disciple, you must hate your father, your mother, your wife, your children, your brothers and sisters, and even your own life. I try to imagine what the crowd there listening to him must have done when he said that. You know, I kind of, you know, you realize that Jesus is outside and he's talking to a multitude. They're probably seated on the ground. Some may be standing. Some may be doing what people do when they're seated on the ground and listening to somebody speak, kind of like what they do inside. You know, they're just kind of looking down, looking around, you know. And Jesus says, you want to be my disciple, you're going to have to hate your father, mother, husband, wife, sister, brother, children, even your own life. I think that's an attention-grabbing. I'm not saying Jesus said that to grab attention, but I'm saying that that's one of those things that you kind of go, what did he say? So when we have that statement by Jesus, we need to reconcile that with other things in the New Testament. Excuse me. And what I mean by that is this. You know, there are a lot of people come to the Bible, pull a verse out, and say, well, this is what the Bible says. Yes, but how does that go with other things the Bible says? In other words, that, somebody showed me a passage years ago from the Psalms Psalm 119, where there's a verse in Psalm 119. Psalm 119 is the longest chapter in the Bible, as we call it. But the statement is made, the sum, S-U-M. And what a sum is, for those of you who are not mathematically inclined and forgot math when you left school, the sum of 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3. In other words, the sum of 1 plus 1 plus 1 is not 1, it's not 2, it's 3. And you add them all together. And what the psalmist said is the sum of your word, talking to God, is true. In other words, that when you take everything that God has said about something, then you have what's true. You don't just pull one passage out of the Bible and say, that's true. Well, in one way it is, but you need to understand that there are ways of understanding that have to be reconciled with other things. So what do I mean? Okay, Jesus has said here, you must hate these different people, these different relationships you have. Yet, when somebody came to Jesus to talk about the greatest command, he said, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second, you shall love your neighbor like yourself. Paul, writing to the church at Ephesus, tells wives to love their husbands, husbands to love their wives, as Christ loved the church, gave himself up for her. And then tells parents to love their children. So obviously, Jesus is not contradicting the rest of the Bible when he says to hate here. That there has to be something going on that we need to understand. There has to be a point that he has in mind, because we understand that I show my love for Jesus by loving other people. I show my love for Jesus by loving my wife. I show my love for Jesus by loving my children. So what does he mean? There's a word, and it's funny, when we talk about Bible and New Testament, we often talk about Greek words in the Bible that translate into English. We're going to talk about a Greek word that's just been brought into English. And that word is hyperbole. And I know many of you are familiar with this word, but hyperbole is a really interesting word. The Greek is 2 words. Hyperbole. And what it literally means is to throw beyond. So imagine you've got a ball and you're playing catch with somebody and you throw the ball beyond that person. Now, with some of us that may be intentional, with some of us that may be just because we just can't play and throw. But the idea is that you've thrown it beyond. Hyperbole is a device in literature where we recognize that somebody is making a statement that is what we would call an exaggeration. That is, that it's going beyond the point, to make the point. And so what Jesus is making the point here is Matthew 10:37 is a parallel passage. Only in this passage, instead of saying hate, Jesus says, you cannot love more. Get the point? That you cannot love your husband, your wife, your parents, your children, your brothers, your sisters, or even yourself more than you love me. That it's a statement, it's a relative term that Jesus is using here when he uses the word hate for loving less. And it is so much less that it is hate by comparison. It isn't hate as a reality, it's hate as a comparative term. You know, we experience this sometimes in our romantic lives, don't we? I mean, I had a number of young ladies in my life as a teenager. And then I met one. And she was so far beyond that girls that I thought I had affection for were nothing in my affection compared to her. Kind of get the point? And don't come up after me and say, "Who is she?" It is a love without rivals. Jesus is trying to get across the idea, you want to be his disciple, you're going to have to be single-minded in your life. And realize he's using that idea of the agape. This is not about affection and about emotion. This is about commitment, about giving oneself. Remember, as Jesus is saying this, there's a really important background, and I think it's really important to kind of, that Jesus immediately moves into the idea, then after talking about this, that he talks about taking up your cross. And when Jesus brings up the word cross, what would the crowd have understood? Jesus knows that his path is headed toward the cross. Nobody else does. When he tries to warn his disciples, or at least to tell them that this is coming, excuse me, they will say things like, "Oh no, that can't happen." Not possible, Lord. I love it in Matthew 16 when right after Peter's made what we call the Great Confession, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. You know, and then Jesus tells his disciples that he's going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to be crucified. And Peter says, "There's no way we're going to let that happen to you." But Jesus knows. But as he says this, the crowd doesn't. The apostles don't. So what's going through their mind when Jesus mentions that word cross? The Jews are a subjugated people. Crucifixion is a part of their life. They see the crosses at the side of the road, usually at crossroads, where many people go by. Why? Because it's a public execution. It's nasty. It's demeaning. It's humiliating. And Jesus says, you want to be my disciple? You better take up your cross and follow me. So, there is a prophetic element here. And that Jesus knows and he's sharing them. And he's saying to the people, follow me. Well, we understand 2,000 years later that Jesus has the cross in his view and he's telling them to follow. But they don't when he says it. Follow me. Take up your cross. In Luke 9:23, just a little bit earlier in Luke, Jesus has said that if you want to be my disciple, whoever wants to be my disciple, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Imagine. For some, that's the second time they've heard that statement. do you think they're going, what does he mean? This is a hard saying, Jesus. This is not something that we're looking to do. The cross is a place of cruel execution. The cross is the path where Jesus is going. The cross is where he's going to offer himself as the perfect sacrifice for the sins of the world. And it's coming through the cross that his disciples will benefit from that sacrifice. And so here it represents a complete personal surrender to following Jesus. Some of you know that one of my favorite books, in terms of books that have had the greatest influence in my life, was a book written by a German Lutheran theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was one of the people who had the guts to stand up against Nazi Germany and to speak out. Ultimately, he died in a German prison because of his conscience and his conviction. But he wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. And one of the most compelling statements that Bonhoeffer made in that book is that when Jesus calls a person, he calls them to come and die. Whoa, that's a hard saying. He said, cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves. It's comfortable, isn't it? Costly grace is Christ on the cross. And it's understanding that when Jesus is calling his disciples to come follow him and take up their crosses, he's calling them to personal surrender and to following him as Lord. Can you imagine what might have gone through Jesus' mind as he said that, thinking how many people there would be that would be, what term I use is nominal, that is in name only. They say, oh yeah, we're disciples of Jesus, but when things get a little difficult, oh, I'm out of here. Don't ask me to be uncomfortable. Don't ask me to do anything I don't want to do. Don't ask me to do anything I've never done before. Don't ask me to do anything that's hard. Don't ask me to stand out from the crowd. Jesus is saying, you want to be my disciple? Stand up with me. And then the third part of this is the counting the cost. And we'll kind of, I think it's fairly self-evident. He starts with talking about a man building a tower. And my paraphrase, what idiot would start to build a tower and not have the money in place to finish it? Turner paraphrase. When my parents lived in the Boston area, Diane and I were driving out in the country one day, and we saw a house built into the side of a hill in the woods. And we were curious, so I drove over to where that house was, and it was a concrete house that had been built in a semicircle into this hill. The top of the house was flat. It was all concrete. The top of the house was flat. The outside of the house facing the valley was pretty well solid concrete. And inside it was designed so you could tell that there were going to be windows facing into what would be kind of a garden area. So it was kind of shaped like a horseshoe built into the side of this hill. And you're wondering, how do I know so much detail about that? Because we parked the car, got out, and explored. Because it was unfinished. You might call it a construction site except for one thing. It was partly done and everybody left. There was nothing left there to build with. It just sitting there. And by the way, it had been weathered, it had been sitting there a long time, and it led to a lot of conversation between us about who would build a house remarkably designed. You know, one of those houses you would ultimately see in a magazine. But it had been started, but not finished. And it left to sit there, my guess is for years. Isn't that amazing? You spend all that money and do all that, but you never finish it. And you think about all the possibilities. Maybe the guy building it died and everything quit. You know, who knows? But that's Jesus' point. Guy starts to build a tower, runs out of money. Imagine going to Toronto and visiting the half CN Tower. Kind of a ridiculous thought, isn't it? But that's his point. You know, who does that? Or what general goes out to fight a battle, or king goes out to fight a battle, and he's got, without sitting down and thinking about, okay, I got 10,000 men, my enemy's got 20,000. This is not a good plan. I think rather than risking my men in a 2-to-1 or 2-against-1 situation, I'm going to make peace. Well, Jesus is talking about finishing what you start. You know, if you're going to start walking with him, he wants you to have thought about it well enough first in my life. You know, I don't get up every morning and say, am I going to be a Christian today? The idea is that when I decided to be a disciple of Jesus, that was the decision for the rest of my life. And so when I get up in the morning, it's how I'm going to walk with Jesus today. Am I going to live my way or his way? You know, so many times, you know, people who profess to be Christians do that. They say, well, yeah, I know Jesus says this, but I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to do it the way I want it. Well, did we count the cost of discipleship? When I'm facing competing demands, when there's entertainment or recreation rather than worship and service. See, what comes first? What things might I have to give up to be a Christian? Lifestyle things? I think maybe more personally, attitude things? And what about when things get tough? You know, one of the things Jesus knew when he was talking to the crowd there was the fact that as his followers went out into the world, right after he would leave, that there would be persecution. There would be the pressure of government saying, you can't do this. You can't talk about this Jesus. And what did they do? They actually stood in front of the council of the Jewish leaders and said, we must obey God rather than men. See, it's counting and knowing what it is that to follow Jesus and to serve him and to be with him and to put him number one. So in about 8 simple verses that are not simple, it's a hard saying, Jesus has summed up the essence of what it is to be his disciple, to be his follower, to be a Christian. It's not wearing a label on me, but it's putting Jesus in the place of control and honor in my life. Glenn's chosen a song for us to close with that expresses the kind of determination and resolve that we need, that we want. I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. Maybe you're here, you're not yet a Christian. We want to encourage you to think about that, and if we can help you with that, encourage you to talk with me, one of the elders, afterward. Or as a Christian, maybe you need to get one of the elders to pray with you, or another brother or sister in Christ to encourage you and strengthen you, to have that kind of resolve, to be the kind of person Jesus is talking about. Let's stand as we sing.